When I first got serious about making videos, exposure didn't mean that much to me. I would hear terms thrown around like overexposed and underexposed, blown out highlights, crushed blacks, and this wasn't something that I understood, and it also wasn't something that interested me that much because that just wasn't yet the aspect of making videos that I was paying attention to. But here's the catch. When you get serious about trying to be able to take a vision and bring that to life, the little details will become increasingly more important. And at some point, you're going to realize that exposure is a pretty important part of the process. So this is going to be a multi-part series of lessons. Today, what I want to do is introduce you to the concept of exposure and take you through some of the basic settings that can help you to manipulate exposure with your camera. So to start, let's just look at an image. Let's look at a video clip. And what you're seeing right now, I want you to pay attention to the brightest parts of the image. Notice whether or not you can make out details in the brightest parts of the image. And as we adjust the camera settings, notice that more of the image is becoming difficult to see. And so this is an example of blown out highlights. When your highlights are going to pure white, you don't see any detail. And if we continue to push this to its extreme, you now have an overexposed image. Now we can look at the reverse scenario. So if instead you focus on the darkest parts of the image that you're looking at, notice the detail. Ask yourself, do you see any detail in the darkest parts of the image or the shadows? And now notice as adjustments are made that it becomes increasingly more difficult to notice detail and that more of the image is losing detail in the shadows. And if we continue to push this, we have now an underexposed image. So now I think you can see that the main goal here with exposure is we want to be able to see the images that we're capturing clearly with maximum detail. So how do we do that? Well, there's 3 settings that I want to introduce you to today, and we're going to go through them one at a time. They are the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And so let's start with aperture. What is that? Well, it's the opening in your camera's lens that allows light to pass through it to the camera's sensor. And it's light hitting the sensor that allows you to expose an image. In fact, if you have too much light hitting the sensor, that's where you end up with an overexposed image. And if you have too little light, you're going to have an underexposed image. And the aperture is an opening that we can control. We can open it up wider or we can close it down. Now, how much is going to depend on the lens that you have. But for instance, with this lens that we're shooting with, we have f numbers that we can control. And so we could start with f2.8. And in this case, that is the widest open that the lens goes. And then if we go up in number, let's say we go to something like f5.6, now we're closing down the lens. And so I think it becomes clear that by using this control, we're manipulating the light that's hitting the sensor, which is ultimately what we're trying to do with exposure. Because too much light is bad, too little light is bad. We want to get that optimal light. And one of the settings that we can use, should we choose to, is the aperture by opening and closing it. Now, you might be thinking, if you haven't been introduced to this concept before, you might be thinking that this is a little weird. The higher the number, the more it's closed down. How am I going to remember this? And here's the thing. When you take your camera out, which I'm going to ask you to do at the end of this lesson, and you start using it and you find where your control is for your aperture on your camera, it's very easy to figure out because when you open up the aperture, you're letting more light in. So when you start adjusting the aperture, if the image appears to be getting brighter, you're opening it. If it appears to be getting darker, you're closing it down. So that's a basic introduction to the aperture. I think you can see how we can manipulate it to control exposure. Now there's more to say about this. We're going to come back to it in a minute. But next, let's move on to shutter speed. Now the shutter speed is something that controls how long the shutter is open. So if you have the shutter open for a longer period of time, you're going to be exposing each individual frame, each individual image of your video for a longer period of time, and that's going to involve more light. And so if we have a shutter speed that's set that allows the shutter to stay open longer, we're going to have an image that appears brighter. If conversely, we adjust the shutter speed so that it's open for a shorter period of time, we're going to be dealing with less light. And that could also be something that we use to manipulate exposure, but there's a catch here, because when shooting video, typically we follow the 180-degree rule. And that's a rule that says that your shutter speed should be determined by your frame rate, and it should be determined in such a way that the denominator of your shutter speed is twice that of the frame rate you're shooting with. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want to shoot with a shutter speed of 1/48th of a second, or as close to that as possible. And with your camera, that might be 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, again, we want to double the denominator of our shutter speed, which means we want a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. And again, with these, we're trying to get as close as our shutter speed allows us to get. Now, with that in mind, if we're following that rule, we're not going to manipulate shutter speed to help adjust our exposure. So it's going to be locked off. Now, there's more to say about shutter speed in the 180-degree rule. So again, just like aperture, we're going to come back to it in a minute. But first, the last and final setting that we're talking about today is the ISO, or it might be gain control on your camera. I have a camera actually that allows you to switch, and it could be that you're making adjustments in terms of ISO or gain. It doesn't matter which though, because the concept is basically the same, and that is that as you make adjustments in the ISO, you're adjusting the camera's sensitivity, or the camera's sensor's sensitivity to light. And so if we are in an environment, we have our settings locked in, and we see that the image looks too dark, we could boost the ISO, and that would increase exposure. That would make our image look brighter. Now, ISO is a great way to manipulate exposure and make small adjustments when you have everything else locked off. But again, there's always a catch, and the catch here is that all three of these settings have byproducts or artifacts that they create when you manipulate them. And so in reverse order, starting with ISO, the problem that we can run into is the more we manipulate ISO, the more we increase the ISO of our camera, the more noise we can introduce into the image. And you can think of noise similar to grain that appears in film, but it's not quite the same, because many people find grain in film to be an attractive quality, not so much with noise in digital video. And so most cameras are going to have a range that it's safe to manipulate your ISO without introducing too much noise. And you're going to want to learn your camera's limits so that you know the range that you feel is safe for you to do so as far as adjusting exposure. Now, working backwards, what is the artifact that shutter speed adds to video? Well, that is motion blur, and this is why the 180-degree rule exists. It's because setting your shutter speed at twice the frame rate creates what we consider to be optimal motion blur. Now you might be asking, why is it called the 180-degree rule? Well, that comes from cinema cameras, which instead of shutter speed have a shutter angle, and that angle is 180 degrees to achieve optimal motion blur, and that is tantamount to twice the frame rate for your shutter speed. So what happens is, if we have the shutter open for a longer period of time, if we expose each individual frame for a longer period of time, if all things are set, exposure looks good, and we make that adjustment, you're going to see that the image gets brighter, and then you might make additional adjustments to compensate for that. But what you'll also see is more motion blur added to the video. And the reverse is true, that being that as you adjust your exposure time so that the shutter is open for a shorter period of time, you're going to have less motion blur. Now, these are things that you can manipulate for stylistic reasons. Perhaps you want to create a dreamlike sequence, and so you want to shoot with more motion blur. Or maybe you want to make the viewer uneasy, so you adjust your shutter speed so that there's practically no motion blur, and it just doesn't look natural. So again, these are things you can manipulate for stylistic reasons, but in most situations, you're going to follow the 180-degree rule. Now, the last of the settings is the aperture. And with aperture, as we adjust whether our aperture is open wide or whether we're closing it down, we're manipulating something called depth of field. The artifact that appears in video as you manipulate aperture is really how much of the image is in focus. So the depth of field is how much of the image in front of or behind what you're shooting is in focus. So for instance, if you want to create a blurry background effect, or what's called bokeh, you can manipulate the aperture. How do you do that? Well, the wider open the aperture is, the more shallow a depth of field you have. And so more of the image is going to appear blurry, or you're going to get that bokeh effect. And as you close the aperture down, the wider a depth of field that you have. So those are the three settings. Those are the three artifacts that are involved. Now, knowing that shutter speed is pretty much locked off, what I want you to do is take your camera out. Before we move on to the next lesson, it's important you get some hands-on experience with these settings. Take your camera out, go in different settings, shoot indoors with available lights, and manipulate your aperture. Manipulate the ISO or the gain control on your camera. Then go outside, go out in the sun, go in the shade, see how these settings work. Try to get acquainted with not just what they're capable of, but what their limitations are. And then in the next lessons, we're going to come back, we're going to get a little bit deeper, and we're going to try to understand not just how to use these settings, but we're going to look at some of the other variables that are involved in the decision-making process when it comes to obtaining optimal exposure.